right, great. I might get started, everyone. I'd like to just say thank you very much, everyone, for coming along today. It's fabulous to see so many faces. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we gather and pay my respects to elders past and present and to emerging community leaders. And thanks to the earth for sustaining us. Our talk today will focus on two aspects of the consumption of animals and animal products. For the first half of the talk, we'll hear from Scott Wallace, who will cover the impacts of animal agriculture on the environment, as well as aspects of our relationship with nature. For the second half of today's talk, we'll hear from Associate Professor Kelly Fielding, who will talk to us about some of the psychological influences affecting our dietary choices. So I'll just quickly introduce Scott and Kelly before I ask them to get started. So Scott is an environmental scientist and independent scientific advisor, and he does actually periodically work for UQ as a scientific educator at the Moreton Bay Research Station. He is a dedicated conservationist and activist, and I'm actually really pleased to welcome him to campus today because he's recently spent several weeks at sea on the MV Steve Irwin as part of Sea Shepherd's Operation Reef Defence, a campaign to stop the Adani coal mine from going ahead near the Great Barrier Reef. Kelly is a social and environmental psychologist whose research focuses broadly on understanding the social and psychological determinants of environmental sustainability. She seeks to understand environmental decisions and behaviours and to develop communication and behaviour change strategies that can promote greater environmental sustainability. So I'd like to ask Scott to kick things off, and also just mention that we'll have time at the end for quick Q&A, so if you do have any questions that pop up as we're going through, please make a note of them and you'll have time to ask them at the end. Great. Thank you, Scott.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and support for Sea Shepherd's campaigns. I wasn't expecting that. So, I've been out at sea for about a month now, and so it's good to be back on land. And I'm really stoked to kick off the next chapters with this event and being here collaborating with UQ today. So thank you guys so much. I'm pretty much going to be bombarding you guys with a whole bunch of different facts, statistics, concepts, ideologies over the next 20 minutes, right? So the way I'm going to present information to you may be visual, maybe graphs, maybe with words. So hopefully some of that resonates with a little bit of everyone, and you take the most important messages from what I have to share with you today and some perspectives from that. I encourage you to question all the stats and facts that I give you because that's what we need to be doing. We can't be taking things for granted that is the accurate, most up-to-date stat. We've got to do our own research in that regard. But I'm going to be giving you information that I've been gathering and collecting over the last 4, 5, 6 years as a scientist, as someone who's been studying at Griffith, and also my own personal journeys and research into sustainability, into conservation, and things that are very important to myself and us as a species. Alrighty, so it's important to understand sort of some of the foundations of where we're operating. How's our society sitting at the moment? Because it can actually explain a lot. So what we've had these very anthropocentric ideologies and human-centered worldviews that have really underpinned our entire system of governance, law, politics, and really our culture. And our relationship with nature over the years has really been human-centered. And so aspects of this relationship, just going to pull apart this. So we've had this human superiority. We've seen us as separate from nature. We've seen ourselves as superior to nature. Additionally, we have these hierarchies, these arbitrary hierarchies where we see certain animals as being more valuable and more important than other species. But ultimately, it's been every other species as more inferior to us as humans. So there's this term called speciesism, which is a very important one to understand. And it's something that has really affected my relationship with nature over the years. Commodification of nature. We own animals under our legal system. Sentient creatures are considered property. They're objects, they're not subjects. That's something that really needs to be challenged. And so, as a result of this, we've really had... go back. So, we have exploited non-human animals for a variety of reasons. One of the, over 90% of the exploitation of non-human animals is for our food systems, the animal agriculture industry. So I'm talking about the global collective industry that is creating products, milk, eggs, dairy, meat. So whether it's small-scale local farms to broad-scale agriculture, I'm lumping it all under because these are collective impacts on the globe. So we don't really think about the effects of our diets on the environment, but we're so disconnected from that whole process. We don't know what goes into those products, and it's important that we start delving into that to really understand what is the contribution of our diets to sustainability and what's the contribution of our diets to our footprint, because it's been largely understated, and there's a lot of suppression of information that I've experienced firsthand coming through institutions where the facts aren't given to us. So I'm here to sort of give as much of that as I can and share that out with the wider community for the hopes of educating and inspiring people to understand, be empowered, and take action from that. So globally, what we've got, we're either clearing a whole bunch of land to grow crops and food for animals, which are then usually kept in another area. So we're clearing more forest and using more land in other areas. Depending on the country, it's either like livestock is mainly grain-fed, which is where we're growing plant-based foods to feed animals, or it's on pasture or grazing on natural vegetation. Here in Australia, the majority of our animal agriculture is based off grazing, so we're clearing land to replace it with grass, right? So 56% of Australia's total land is just used for grazing for animal agriculture. That's half of our country just for grazing livestock. Insane. It's really quite alarming when we look at the maps. You can see, the portion of land that's used for grazing compared to other aspects of our land use. This is one of the most startling facts that I came across a few years ago. So bringing it to a regional level, we've had this deforestation crisis here in Queensland for a very long time, right? And the actual, we've heard a lot about the mining industry and houses and urban developments that are, sprawling and stop clearing land and you're hurting the habitat. But actually, between 2015 and 2016, 93.4% of all of the land cleared in Queensland was for animal agriculture. The mining industry accounted for 0.75%. Settlements, cities, rural areas, 0.25%. So we've got to be cautious about the information that we're receiving and what are the actual main drivers of deforestation. The animal ag sector in Australia is the single largest driver of deforestation, species loss and habitat loss, very unequivocally. That's what we're dealing with at the moment. In terms of waste, there's about 60 billion animals on our planet that we're rearing and breeding into existence to be exploited, right? They have a lot of shit every single day. So in the US, the waste from animals is 130 times more than all the human waste in that country. 130 times. What this equates to is 3.1 million kilos of shit per minute. Now, there's no pesky laws that require this stuff to be treated by farmers. It goes into the waterways, into the land, it just seeps and it sits there and it's contributes to a whole bunch of diseases. A farm with 2,500 dairy cows creates the same amount of waste as a city of over 400,000 people. We've got over 1 million head of dairy cattle in Australia. Work it out. So here in Australia, just to put it simply, this light, dark green areas are the only areas where more than 10% of the businesses engage in animal waste management. Everything else is less than 10% of businesses that they don't engage in animal waste management. So that's what's happening in Australia. This means, crap into our waterways, onto our food, everything. It's pretty full on. So, actually, let me just get back to this one. So we have all these nutrients and fertilizers and waste that enters our water systems, right? And this increase in nutrient load can really affect things like coral reefs, when we have algal blooms and these nutrient blooms, which really affect and destabilise marine ecosystems. 75% of the runoff into the Great Barrier Reef catchment area, into the Great Barrier Reef, is actually from animal agriculture, from grazing. So yeah, there's other sources of runoff, but animal ag, primary driver of soil load and turbidity and nutrients and fertilizers into our marine ecosystems. Animal agriculture globally is the single largest driver of contributing to ocean dead zones, and again, the single largest driver of deforestation and species loss across the globe. And those patterns are mirrored here in Australia. Water use. So about a third of global fresh water is used for animal agriculture. So much water on this planet is used for animal agriculture. That's in terms of growing the food, the water that goes into growing the food, plant-based foods, which humans could be consuming, which is then given to animals. The water that the animals are consuming themselves, and then after that, they have their throat slit and they are given to a handful of humans and individuals. So it's a very inefficient system where we're putting in more calories and protein than we are getting out in terms of edible animal flesh. So it's very, very inefficient. 67% of water in Australia is used for agriculture. So not just animal agriculture, but the whole agriculture sector. I can't find more up-to-date information, so please check it out yourself. But of that, about 70 to 80% is used for animal agriculture. And of that, 43% is just used for pasture and hay production. So we are putting so much water into growing food for livestock, and it's really being wasted. We're experiencing crazy droughts at the moment. So one hamburger equates to about 3,000 litres of water being used. That's 2 months' worth of showers. So understand that next time, hopefully not, you go to consume a hamburger, understand the footprint that's behind that meal. We really need to understand that. If you left your tap on for like weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, that's probably what you're looking at. So we need to equate these things to what we can relate to. Anyway, massive water footprint. This stuff concerned me the most. So throughout my studies, I was told that climate change is being driven by fossil fuel industry, right? I looked at some of the reports from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. They were saying that conservatively, 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from animal agriculture. That's more than the global transport sector. More than boats, cars, planes, trains, ships together. Okay? Following that, we had a group called World Watch Institute. Come on, man. Why is this not working? Sorry. World Watch Institute, they took the modelling from the United Nations and said, hey, you guys aren't taking into account so many things in your models. You're not looking at the respiration of 60 billion land animals, a lot of the waste management, a lot of the land that's cleared for animal farming. They didn't take a lot of that into account. They took those models, said, hey, include this, and you probably got a closer estimate. They said 51% of global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the livestock sector. I lost sleep over this stuff after reading these reports because this shattered my understanding of environmental issues, shattered my understanding of what I thought was driving climate change and so many things. Now, to back this up, a group called Beyond Zero Emissions back in 2014 did a research paper on land use and agricultural emissions, and they estimated that 54% of Australia's national greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the agricultural sector, including plant-based agriculture, but like the general agriculture sector. Majority of that, the overwhelming majority of that is animal agriculture. In Australia, I believe that this is the single largest driver of climate change in our country and across the globe. Please check out these papers, read it for yourself, come up with your own opinions. Okay, we can't talk about the environmental impacts of agriculture on the environment without considering all members of the Earth community, non-human animals and human animals. So I put that up briefly, but would anyone like to have a guess as to how many animals are slaughtered in Australia in 3 months? For those who didn't see that stat. Any guesses? Everyone saw it. 1 million, more. So in 3 months in Australia, this is straight off the government websites, 170 million animals had their throats slit to provide Australians and other countries with animal products. So that's what we are contributing towards. This is the industry that we are driving through our consumption. As long as we support these industries, we have immense amounts of unnecessary suffering. 156 million chickens, like it's crazy. Awesome. So in summary, the animal agriculture industry is an absolute ecological disaster. Absolute ecological disaster. The leading driver of so many environmental harms that it was concerning once I realised the actual effect, scale and magnitude of animal farming. It needs to be addressed, and the tricky thing is that this is driven by our consumption, our desire for these products. As soon as we stop consuming these products, the environmental footprint decreases of these industries. Simple supply and demand. You can look at economics. So the United Nations, these are the solutions. United Nations urge for a global shift to a meat, dairy-free diet. United Nations saying we need to go vegan. Not just me, not just other crazy vegans saying, hey, look at this. The United Nations is saying this stuff. This is disregarded. You won't see about governments talking about this. You won't see reports which say, hey, action need to tackle our consumption to minimise the worst effects of climate change. You will not see it out there. But the truth is out there for those who seek it. And I encourage you all to go into that. Go into those voices in the back of your mind. Go into the stats that are going to challenge your understanding, because through that is like complete mental liberation. So explore it. We can simply reduce our footprint in terms of our diets by adopting a plant-based diet. It's very simple. Where you're going to be using a fraction of the water, a fraction of the land, a fraction of the resources. It's not about having a zero footprint, because no one has a zero footprint. But we can really drastically reduce our footprint by adopting a plant-based vegan diet. And I really think my advice as an environmental scientist to you all is that the quickest, cheapest way to minimise your footprint is to go vegan. I didn't think that for most of my life, and then things got sort of overwhelming after researching the facts and the stats, because I wasn't taught a lot of this information during my environmental science degree here on the Gold Coast. We are experiencing an insane amount of suppression of information. Any information that challenges the status quo and our current understanding of the way things are, anything that challenges profits is going to be attempted to be suppressed. So it's pretty crazy. Now, in an ideal situation, I'm up here saying, hey, go plant-based to minimise your footprint. And you guys are like, Scott, thank you so much. Yes, I'm going to do it right now. Doesn't happen like that. There's so many other things, right? Awesome. So I want to sort of address some of the challenges and some of our barriers to adopting a plant-based diet. Now, this is the first one. I'd like you all to imagine you've gone to a friend's place, sitting down for dinner, and the host serves up this meal. And I'd like to get your responses. How do you first feel when you see this meal? You just want to yell it out. Looks good? Yeah. No, a couple head nods. Most people are like, yeah, looks all right. I think it looks scrumptious, looks delicious. So you're eating this lasagna, and you ask your host, you're like, what is in this meal? Like, it's so nice. Please tell me. The host says, the secret is all in the meat. All you use is like 1/2 kilo of well-seasoned Labrador meat. How do we feel now about this meal? Some more head nods. Disgusted. Yeah. So it's interesting, because if I was to say it's a beef lasagna, it's a chicken lasagna, you'd be like, yeah, of course, looks like it. Yeah, sure. All good. And we wouldn't be disgusted. As soon as I mention it's dog flesh that's in this lasagna, all of a sudden our appetites shift. Now, this hasn't changed. The item, I haven't changed the slide, I haven't done anything. Your perception is what's affecting your disgust to this food product. So the reason why some of us are detested by the consumption of dog flesh, and the reason why other cultures continually to exploit and eat dogs, and Japanese are eating whales, and some of the Asian countries are eating dogs, and we're eating cows. Like, really, what is the difference between all of these sentient creatures? The difference is our conditioning. The difference is the paradigm we've been operating under and how we relate to the natural world. And I've experienced this conditioning throughout my environmental science degree, where I was told these animals are more important than others. These you need to conserve. These are pests. These are rodents. They need to be exterminated. There's no value for the intrinsic life of all these creatures. So I've fed into this system for a very, very long time, and I'm totally guilty of that. And we all have. Most of us have been supporting these industries. and acting in a way that I think has been out of alignment with our core values. So that's essentially it. What is the difference there between these two creatures? One's veal, baby cow flesh, if you want to be accurate. The other's a dog. So if I was to have a baby cow here in front of you guys and started abusing it and kicking it, everyone who's still consuming animal products would be like, dude, get off that cow. Don't touch it. No, stop. Because that's our compassion. That's our respect. That's our love for life and for engagement and, just cuddles and good vibes, right? But why is it that we pay people to mutilate, exploit, and slaughter animals, and then we eat their body parts? We are so disconnected from the impacts of our choices. We are so disconnected from the environmental footprint of our diets, the environmental footprint of our choices, the effect on the animals. We need to remember them. And the consumption of these products is not a personal choice when there's a victim involved. This was hard for me to understand for years and years and years and years and years. But it's about going through that conditioning, understanding what is the difference, and why is it that we love dogs, eat pigs, wear cows. Now we're here linked up with the School of Psychology, and it's all about psychology, understanding what drives us. So Carnism is an invisible ideology that conditions us to eat certain animals. This is a dominant, violent ideology that is underpinning most of our society, which is the reason why we love dogs, eat pigs, wear cows, right? I fed into this paradigm for a very, very long time, not realizing that my actions were not consistent with my beliefs as an individual, and my actions were not consistent with my beliefs as an environmental scientist, as someone who was concerned with animals. Cat lovers don't eat cats. Dog lovers don't eat dogs. Animal lovers don't eat animals. As an environmental scientist, how could I be protecting the reef and looking after the oceans while I'm spearfishing fish, while I'm contributing to their suffering? It's really quite challenging to grapple with that. So this ideology and this conditioning is institutionalized. It's underpinned everything we have been exposed to. And the reason why we haven't asked why we love dogs, eat pigs, wear cows is because of this, is because of carnism, is because of, as long as we stay disconnected from our values, our core values, then we will continue to support an industry and continue to exploit animals, which is actually against our deeper will. Because if I was to put a child here and in front of the child put an apple and a bunny rabbit, I bet you the child's not going to rip the head off the bunny rabbit. He's going to be playing with the apple. So what's our core values? Who are we as individuals? What have we been exposed to? We need to understand all those things in order to move forward in an empowered and informed way, to live in alignment, to minimize our footprint, and really start looking after all members of the Earth community. Because it's not just about humans, it's about all life on Earth, right? All life has value. Veganism. So veganism is essentially about avoiding all forms of exploitation to animals. What I only realized recently was the best reasons we have for exploiting and eating animals is culture, taste, convenience, and pleasure. I thought there'd be better reasons. There's not. We don't live in a society where we need to consume any animal products to survive and thrive. I thought we did for 23 years. People out there have believed this for 6-7 decades. The earlier we understand these things, the earlier we start challenging these destructive ideologies that have affected our choices and our free will, we can start really minimizing our footprint and looking after all animals out there. So I want to leave you on the philosophy of veganism, which is not just a diet, but a plant-based diet that the United Nations is advocating for, remember, feeds into this broader philosophy. It's not just a fad. This is something that is about non-violence towards ourselves, towards non-human animals, minimizing our footprint, and for humans as well, because we are growing enough food on this planet to feed 800 million people, enough grain to feed 800 million people. Where does that go to? Livestock. We have enough water and food on this planet to feed 60 billion animals. It's a myth that we have a food shortage on this planet. It's bullshit. It is not true. We have enough food. We have enough water. It's about inefficiencies in these systems. It's about where is all these resources being put towards. And when we stop supporting these industries and start seeing a shift in governance and policies and laws and consumption and advertising and marketing, which says, get some pork on your fork, get some beef on your plate, eat a baby lamb on the 26th of January because that's our culture. Question all that, because I did. It was unsettling. It was saddening. I came to some very crazy realizations about myself and my role on this planet and who I was as an individual. Who was I as a member on the Earth community? And you can create that. Shape your vision. Shape whoever you are. But understand your actions may not be always reflecting your values. It was very hard for me to swallow. Pun intended. So, over the last few years, I've been engaging in a bit of activism, a bit of advocacy, just to get some of the messages that I've shared with you guys here today. So if anyone is interested in following some of the work I'm doing on social media, if you just search on Instagram or Facebook at Earth Centered, you'll find my pages, some videos and some content that I put up. I've just started a YouTube channel as well. If you search Scott Wallace or find me on Facebook and I'll send you the links. Put up a few lectures and, I'm going to start doing some more videos. So what Earth-centeredness is about is seeing ourselves as one part of an interconnected, interrelated, interdependent system, right? Where we are respecting the rights of all members of the Earth community to survive and flourish and evolve and exist without our exploitation. And so Earth-centeredness is a way that I really think we can start seeing massive shifts in the world. That needs to start with being Earth-centered within ourselves, in our hearts first. Then things flow on. Then we start seeing shifts in industries. So, as Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see in the world. Don't wait for someone else to do it. Go kick some ass.
Thanks, Scott. Some really, really sobering statistics. Not the first time I've seen them. So I'm going to hark back to a Sustainability Week event that I attended a couple of years ago. I think it was a couple of years ago. Christine was also the organiser, and it was a really great event. We saw a showing of the documentary Cowspiracy. And then afterwards there was a panel discussion. I'm not sure if anyone who's in the room this time was there last time. And it was a great discussion. And the very last question of the evening was a passionate young vegan who said, now that you've got all of the facts, how can you possibly keep eating animals? And she asked that of the panel. And so we all did our best to provide a response to that question, and I think most people were coming from a very authentic and personal place, and I was one of those people who also tried to give a response. I didn't get a great reaction for my response, and so I'm going to try to give it a bit more airplay today. Hopefully, with a little bit more time, I can make the point that I was trying to make that evening a couple of years ago a little bit more understandable to people. So yeah, it is. I mean, as somebody who cares a lot about the environment and tries to make a lot of changes in my own life, it is hard when you've got all the facts and figures in front of you. It's really hard to work out, well, how come everyone isn't changing? And so one of the key arguments I want to make today is because we are embedded in social contexts, and those social contexts keep many of those behaviours in place. Now, Scott spoke about us as being individuals, but the reality is we are not always thinking about ourselves as individuals. A lot of the time, we are thinking about ourselves in terms of our memberships in particular groups. We may not be consciously doing that, but we are still doing it. And so it's those memberships that can actually influence our behaviour. Now, is this the clicker? Okay. All right. Okay. So, all right. There we go. So, So we're part of these social contexts. We have these group memberships, and those group memberships can have a big influence on our behaviour. Now, here's some data, and I meant to say this first up, but I want to say it now so I don't forget. I want to thank my PhD student, Hannibal Tai, who's here somewhere. Where is he? There you are. So I want to thank Hannibal. Now, Hannibal's PhD thesis is really focusing on this very question, and so he knows a lot more about this than I do, actually. And so some of this data has come from him, so thank you, Hannibal. So let's think about something like gender identity. This is very central to the way that we think about ourselves, right? And there's some really interesting stats about who is a vegan or who is a vegetarian. And you know what? A lot of vegans and a lot of vegetarians are female. Overwhelmingly, vegans and vegetarians are female. And it's the same for, reducing meat consumption. Why might that be the case? Researchers have looked at this. There's been a big area of research, in the literature on, meat consumption or animal consumption. And what that research has really shown is that, men's food, this is not what I believe, I'm sure it's not what we in the audience believe, but the research says men's food is things like hamburgers and beef and potatoes and beer. Women, on the other hand, women's food is salads and pasta and yogurt and fruit and chocolate, okay? So, this notion of, men and women, we eat different food and we demonstrate our masculinity and femininity through the food that we actually eat. And so meat-centred diets are perceived to be masculine, okay? So it becomes central to the masculine identity to actually eat meat. And if you do a little thought experiment, let's do a little thought experiment. So I've got a guy that I met many, many years ago when I was travelling overseas. His name was Mick, and he was a carpenter. Mick the carpenter. He was a really great Aussie guy. And the thing with Mick the carpenter is he didn't eat meat. He didn't drink alcohol. And so what was really interesting to me was that when he came to visit me one time back in Australia, and we were at a barbecue, a friend's barbecue, somebody said, so Mick, you want a beer, mate? And he's like, no, mate, don't drink. And the guy was like, oh, no, can't be right. You want a beer, mate, Mick? Don't you? And he was like, no, mate, don't drink. And it was really interesting to me to kind of see the pressure that he got to actually drink, because here he is, this Aussie bloke, how can he possibly not drink? As a woman, I have never received that pressure. Now, let's kind of transpose that example to Mick the carpenter at the Aussie barbecue, and someone says, so, Mick, you want a snag? No, mate, don't eat meat. Just doesn't no, it can't be right. Here, you have a snag, mate. Have a bit of, it's on the barbecue. It's good for you, mate. It's like, no, don't eat meat. So you can see that, it's a barrier. So if you're a man and you're inhabiting a certain kind of social context, then actually your masculine identity is going to be a barrier to deciding to be a vegan or a vegetarian, or even maybe to reduce your meat consumption. So, eating meat is normative. It's part of the socially prescribed norms of a gender identity. Even if we go beyond gender identity to national and cultural identity. Okay, so Scott already highlighted the fact that it's considered un-Australian not to eat meat on Australia Day. Of course, this is a marketing ploy, right? But I think what they're doing is picking up on something that, is already out there, which is, we're Australians, barbecues are what we do, and so, meat is a really central part of our culture and our identity. And we can see that, for example, there's 11% of Australians who are vegetarian, a much greater percentage in other cultures where it's much more acceptable for a range of reasons to be a vegetarian. Now, I have to say that it's a great revelation to me now compared to in the past to go to a barbecue where I can have some grilled halloumi or some, kind of veggie sausages. So we've come a long way, I think, from the sort of grilled, vegetables, which weren't really that appetising at a barbie. So these social identities are an important barrier to actually, your decisions to actually eat meat or, to reduce your meat consumption. Another, I think, really interesting finding is that in some cultures, in emerging economies, meat eating is a form of status. Okay, so if your income is increasing, then you're going to eat more meat, whereas in developed world countries like Australia, what you're getting is an inverse relationship. So the more highly educated or the higher income that you have, the less likely you are to eat meat. And whether that's because you no longer need to eat meat to kind of show that you're high status, whether it's because you're becoming better educated and you're understanding to a much greater extent the ethical and the environmental implications of eating meat. We don't have that data, but certainly what we're seeing is differences in the ways in which meat eating signifies something about our identities. Now, just let me take a little drink of water. From a theoretical perspective, the way we can understand this is, by drawing on something like social identity theory. So what this theory says is that, we have these self-concepts that are made up of lots of different identities, which relate to the groups that we belong to, okay? So if we're thinking about ourselves in terms of that particular identity, whether it's a male identity or an Australian identity, then we internalise the norms and the values of those groups, and they guide our decisions and our behaviours. So if we act in accordance with those norms and values of the group, then we are being, normative, okay? And that's a good thing because people expect us to do what other people in the group do. On the other hand, if we run counter to it, if we do something that is not in accordance with those norms and values, then people are suddenly looking at us going, what's wrong with it? It's like Mick the carpenter, the good Aussie bloke who doesn't drink and now he doesn't eat meat. It's like, what's wrong with this dude? And so in essence, you could be considered to be a deviant, okay? So not deviant in the way that we often conceptualise it, but you're deviating from what is considered normative behaviour. Now, so our identities can be an important barrier to whether or not we make decisions to reduce our meat consumption or give up meat entirely. Another barrier that I want to highlight is that if you do decide to be a vegan or a vegetarian, okay, this is a moral decision. It's an ethical behaviour. And what you're presenting to the people that you talk to is an upward moral comparison. Okay, so you are somebody who is engaging in moral behaviour and, you're doing it for ethical reasons. So you could actually make people feel bad, okay? So you could make people feel inferior because of your decisions. You could make people feel confused. Oh my God, should I be doing that as well? Or you could make people feel like you're about to reproach them for the fact that you do eat meat. Now, I have to say, when I was preparing this talk, I thought about leaving this section out because I thought there's going to be a lot of vegans and vegetarians in the audience, and I'm only a pescatarian, and what will they think of me? They'll judge me. And so I had that experience myself of thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be judged because I still eat, some forms of animals. And so the thing is, with feeling, with that sense of, feeling, that you might be judged, or just feeling bad, is we want to do something to make ourselves feel better. Well, how do we do that? Well, maybe we kind of we get suspicious about the people. It's like, what are their real intentions? Or, we trivialise them. Oh, these bloody do-gooders, who are trying to, save the world. Or we decide we don't like people, because, and, you only have to go to the internet, into Google Images and type in vegan to come up with a lot of very negative imagery about vegans. And in fact, I know vegans who will not declare themselves to be vegans. In fact, they talk about the fact that they eat a plant-based diet. And so people are aware that this is the way they're going to be viewed. In fact, I did a study with one of my honours students a couple of years ago, and we recruited vegans into our study, and we asked vegans, well, how do you think you're viewed by other people? And you can see it's pretty clear, right? So to the question, how do you think non-vegans think of vegans in general? 1 is very negative, 7 is very positive. The mean response was 2.66. So they think when they view us negatively. Do vegans think non-vegans feel that they're inferior? Yes, that's the case. How much do you think non-vegans like vegans? 2.96, not very much. So this is vegans' perceptions of how they're viewed, okay? Now, one of the important consequences of this is it might be a disincentive, right, for people to decide that they want to become a vegetarian or a vegan because they know that these groups are not viewed positively. I think the other important consequence is that, here it comes. The other important consequence is that people might not be so ready to talk about their ethical reasons for being a vegetarian or a vegan. Should I wait? Yes. And the reason that's important is because the way we talk, when we talk to other people about what we do and the reasons for it, is that's what changes norms, right? That's what communicates, so Scott is up here talking about his own choices and what he does in his life. He is telling us, I've made this decision, you can too. He's changing norms, or he's trying to influence people's norms. I'm sure that point's not going to go down well at all. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make here is that, vegans and vegetarians, they know how other people view them, and because they know that, and if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you'll know that people always ask you why you don't eat meat or why don't you don't eat animals, and you're often having to explain to people, often having to give reasons, and I guess to the extent that people are actually giving reasons like, well, it's good for your health and, it doesn't cost you so much money, you're not communicating the real reasons, you're not, doing what you can to change norms. Okay, so up to this point, it's all been about barriers, so I want to finish off on a more positive note by talking about, well, what do we know about how we can actually influence people's dietary choices, in particular, most of the research has been done about meat. Okay, so yes, if there are studies where people have kept food diaries and they've been sent text reminders telling them why it's good not to eat meat, and that does in fact significantly reduce their meat consumption. Okay, so we can do that. Of course, you've got to be willing to do that in the first place, right? You've got to be interested in the first place. We see things like Meat-Free Monday, and I think this is a recognition that we can't take people from, being, meat eaters to not eating meat at all. In fact, there's some research to show the more incremental your journey is to giving up eating animals, the more likely it is to stick. Okay, so maybe the Meat-Free Monday, which is an incremental approach, is a good one. There's some Dutch researchers, I think, who make a really good point, a really sensible point. Well, probably different strategies are going to work for different segments of the population, right? And so one strategy might be, hey, can we just get you to reduce the amount of meat on your plate? So if you sit down for a meal, make it mostly about plant with just a little bit of meat. If you're somebody who is quite concerned about the way that animals are treated in order for them to be on your plate, and if you're interested and concerned about the environmental impact of animals, then perhaps you can be encouraged for that small amount of meat that you have on your plate to come from sustainable and ethical sources. Of course, there's also lots of meat alternatives out there these days. I think there's getting to be more and more, and so that's going to work for some segments of the population as well. There's some really interesting research about how we actually talk about, vegetarian options. Oh, no, sorry. There it is. Okay, so I found this fascinating. I did not know about this research before Hannibal told me about it. So if you put vegetarian options in their own special section on a menu, people are 56% less likely to actually choose them. So I guess the take-home message is get rid of the vegetarian ghetto of the menu, okay, and incorporate them into the main menu. If you start talking about the sort of vegetarian options as being healthy, which is often the way they're actually spoken about, that actually makes people feel after they've eaten them like they are less satisfied with the taste of it, and they feel less full. Okay, so just the way you talk about things can actually influence people's perceptions and their experiences. This is my personal favourite, so how you label the vegetarian dish. So if you talk about slow roasted caramelised zucchini bites, which, let's face it, sounds delicious, right? People are much more likely to choose that one over simply zucchini. And if it's a toss-up between the slow-roasted caramelised zucchini bites versus the light choice zucchini, let's face it, that sounds bland and boring, right? Okay, 41% more people are going to choose the delicious-sounding zucchini bites. Okay, so how we talk about the vegetarian options could actually influence whether or not people are willing to actually eat them and where they appear in the menu. The final point that I want to make, or second final point I want to make, there's some really great research that is just coming out in the past few years, which is really speaking to this notion of norms and how we can use norms to influence or change people's behaviour. There's been a lot of research about this notion of using descriptive norms, in other words, describing what people do. When we look around in the world or when we hear that everybody's doing it, we go, oh, we should do it too, right? And so, if you tell people that the majority of people are saving energy or conserving water, people are very influenced by that. That's a very effective way to get people to save energy and save water. However, when it comes to something, there are some types of sustainable behaviours where only a minority of people are actually engaging in these behaviours, okay? And obviously, reducing meat consumption is one of those. So can the fact that only a minority of people actually influence people? If we tell, usually it's like, well, only a few people are doing that, I probably don't need to do it, because only a few people are doing it. But if you change the way you talk about that minority, then that can make a difference. So if it's, this is straight out of a study that was conducted a couple of years ago, when they talked about 30% of Americans, starting to reduce their meat consumption, okay, well, that was one thing. When they talked about in the last 5 years, 30% of Americans have started to make an effort to limit their meat consumption. 3 in 10 people have changed their behaviour, have begun to eat less meat. When people feel like they're part of a zeitgeist, okay, they're like, oh yeah, things are changing, then they are significantly more likely in this study to go and actually choose a meat-free lunch. Okay, so it was an actual change in behaviour. And so that sense of things changing, of being part of a change, can be encouraging. Look, let me finish by talking, well, I don't even want to talk about this, I just want to put it out there. Of course, one of the things that we see happening at the moment is this notion of cultured meat. So for anyone who doesn't know how it's done, and I personally don't really know how it's done, except that the little diagram's up here. The tissue is taken from the animal and it's sort of put into a petri dish, and we can grow. It's this sort of frankenfood idea, is the way some people would talk about it. But we can produce meat, and it hasn't come from, we haven't had to have an impact on the environment, and we haven't had to kill an animal in order to do it, as far as I know. Anyway, so there's also an emerging research base. I've got to study myself on this, looking at people's responses to this notion of cultured meat. So that's another, I guess it's almost a technological solution waiting in the wings. Okay, that's it.
Now we've got about 8 minutes or so for questions. If anyone has a burning question they'd like to ask of either Kelly or Scott. Unfortunately, we don't have a roving mic. We did try our best to get one, but it's just not the facilities available to have that. So we might have to speak up. Anyone have a question?
So Scott, last year a paper came out, I haven't read it in a while, but basically trying to model if everyone moved to a vegan diet, we get actually better environmental outcomes due to things like certain land area being able to use for grazing cattle, but not necessarily being able to use to grow soy. Have you read that or have any?
I think I know the paper you're referring to. There's areas where it may be less suitable for plant-based crops than it is for grazing. But I'm certain that starting to shift our consumption is going to be using a shit ton less resources, a lot less land, less greenhouse gases. Again, it's not about being zero footprint. And at the moment, the plant-based veganic farming has the smallest footprint. It's a solid paper if I'm getting that one right, but it's like there's always going to be, and I think we should be looking at how we can be critical about all research that comes out, but there's always going to be ways to say, oh yeah, but see, the vegans didn't get it right, or it's actually not going to be that good. But at the moment, it's nowhere near good. So any shifts and progress is going to be beneficial. Yeah.
Is there the potential that the behaviour change could just be temporary? Like if there's if there's a herd effect where lots of people do something because other people are doing it, but they haven't actually addressed the underlying ethical issues. Is that disconnect still something that, until people actually make the ethical argument, that they might just follow the herd, but then it can also switch back again? So
I'm taking Murray, that's a question for me.
yeah.
So I think that, usually, this is the thing. So usually when the normative interventions are used, it's because you can talk about the fact that most people are on board with actually changing their behaviour. So, the place that they've been used most often is in terms of energy conservation. And so the big population scale studies that have been done in the US don't usually show any kind of rolling back. When you sort of say, most people are saving energy, and you don't get the sort of rebound, as far as I know. I guess the question is, if it's about that idea of using the kind of trending norms, I would think that this is a kind of something that is growing. I think that, if we were looking across time, then I think that, we've got an increase in, probably a bigger increase in the reduction of meat eating or animal consumption. I don't know about the data in terms of, I don't know whether Hannibal knows this, about whether or not there's an increase in the level of vegetarianism or veganism in a place like Australia. I'm not quite sure about that, but I think that there's definite data about the reduction in animal consumption. So, I think that once those sorts of norms start to be entrenched, then I think then a change in behaviour starts to be underpinned by the fact that more people are actually doing it. And the other thing, Murray, that can happen is, to the extent that people can internalise it as part of their identity, then that makes a difference. So, when I look at the cultured meat, as somebody who doesn't eat any kind of red meat, I look at that and I go, I don't want to eat it. And so even though I know it's kind of environmentally, I'm not dissing it or anything like that, but I just kind of go, well, I don't eat that stuff, and so I don't really need to eat that stuff. And so, it's become such an internalised part of my identity. So it is a lot about whether people do internalise. If you're just doing stuff because people, because of what other people do, and you're not kind of internalising it as a part of your values and the kind of broader group norms, then that's a problem.
I'd like to add on top of that.
Yeah.
The stats are that veganism is like skyrocketing across the world. Australia is the third largest growing vegan market, or the third largest vegan market. Veganism has been up like 300-400% in the UK over the last 5-10 years. United States as well. What we're seeing is a widespread adoption in developed nations. And then with the Australian research, the demographics are mainly women that are going vegan. And it's a massive amount compared to men, and then it's obviously excluding everything else on the spectrum. But that was the way they dichotomized it. And there was for ethical purposes. So like the minority categories are going vegan if you're a man for environmental purposes or the health purposes, The data it's pretty overwhelming. It is. I think it's much more than just a trend. If it's a trend towards awareness and consciousness and our just living on this planet in a better way, then it's getting really big. Yeah, it will become a norm. It's just a matter of time. It's beneficial for everyone.
Okay, we've got time for one more question.
Just in terms of the psychology of changing hearts and minds, I'd just like you to comment on, for example, actions like coming to Sydney or Melbourne when some animal activists went in and threw blood all over people in the steakhouse. And just like you to comment on that.
I don't know. I can't speak from an empirical perspective in the sense that I don't know of any research that's been done about that. But my theoretical intuition is that is not going to win over anyone. You know, I don't think that... So I guess the notion of those sort of... I was going to say splashy acts, and I thought, no, I can't say that. The notion of that is to attract attention to the cause, to put it on the agenda. So I think, you know, it depends on the goal. It depends on what your goal is, I think, for any type of activism, right? What's your goal? If your goal is to be noticed and to have this issue on the agenda, then I think that's... then I'm sure it achieved that goal. But if your goal is to communicate to people that caring about animals or being a vegan is something that we can all do, then I think it's going to be counterproductive, because what it's going to communicate is that, you know, you're going to look at people who are doing that, you go, that's not me. I'm not one of those people. And so, you know, you've got that real negative evaluation of the identity. So that's possible, I think. But I do think it's a lot about what are you hoping to achieve from the actual activism.
Yeah. I've been involved in a variety of vegan activism, animal rights activism, and it's about what approach resonates for you as an individual. So for me, it's about informing and explaining, not shaming and blaming, right? So to be able to relate, to be able to understand and communicate my message in that way is what works for me, essentially. There is the idea that, you know, veganism, and there's, you know, militant vegans out there. The crazy thing is, veganism is like literally the least extreme thing I could possibly think of on the face of the planet. Not wanting to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals, right? But because our culture, that is, you know, what's normalised is actually what I think is extreme. And so these acts of like getting attention and throwing blood on people, I think it all has its place, but it depends on those individuals that are engaging in that. I've never done anything like that before. But I would say that the majority of the time it has a counterproductive effect of just getting people's backs up and like, you got bloody blood on my clothes, mate. Fuck. Bloody vegans. Yeah, so it's about, there's no blueprint for any social change, right? Any campaign, how do you best tackle it? No one knows. So...
But I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much, Scott and Kelly, for an absolutely fascinating topic that gives us lots of food for thought. And I'll just give one final plug to the Move Free Burgers food truck and the Farm Animal Rescue hot dog or meat-free hot dog stall in the Great Court, serving up delicious vegan food right now.
And also Animal Liberation Queensland. If you want to go to see what it looks like being in a slaughterhouse, they've got AV equipment. You can go do 3D visual stuff and experience what it's like to relate.
A stall just outside the UQ shop.
There's brochures. Yeah, pleasure. Thank you. I want to get into a slide. There's some references there that I like to explore. Super exciting stuff. I can relate to so much you mentioned and research, because I've been on that, you know, that identity, figuring it out. Awesome. Hey man, dude.
So proud.
Good to see you, man. Oh, I just saw your face. I'm like, where's that?
Yeah, I made it. Did you drive here?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, okay.
I've got a car park.
Okay.
They saved me a car park. So,
I didn't know they had new free burgers here.
yeah, dude. Animal in Queensland, Move Free Burgers. There's a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, that's
Really funny, like just getting some things that stuff with sustainability.
Yeah, finally. It's funnily enough actually that it's like got the whole food court. I walked past like these meaty meals and I'm like on my way to the vegan shop. So I'm like,
Yeah, dude. Sick. That's what we're shifting now. It's going to change.
that was really interesting.
Thanks, dude. Appreciate the feedback.
Trip. I need to go pick up Dan now. He's done it.
Oh, yeah?
Griffin, he was doing something, yeah. They changed their mind last night, like the people I was working with. One of them realised he did the body of a bull and Dan had to do the
Offer the assignment.
yeah, this group thing. So then Dan's up at like 11 o'clock. One of them messaged saying like I've changed the body. So then Dan had to change it to the He's like typing away on the way here.
Oh,
Yeah, they all arrived though like an hour early, so he got to like work with them a bit to fix it. He said they did really good.
so much for coming up, man.
So proud. That was really good. Yeah, yeah, of course.
Cheers,
Anyway,
man.
I'll catch you later.